As was mentioned, my name is Marko. I come from Slovenia, and I'm a quality engineer at Outfit7. And today I kind of want to walk you through some of the hardships and stuff I learned by testing one of our newest games, and how sometimes testing less can mean better results than testing more. So first, a little bit about us. In case you don't know Outfit7, we are most famous as that company that made Talking Tom all those years ago. And if you don't know what Talking Tom is, just ask any younger person than yourself, and you'll hear them talk about a talking cat that they love or hate, whatever it is. Now, that was a super smashing success, but since then, in the last 12 or so years, we've made many other games that are under the same umbrella, such as Talking Tom Gold Run, My Talking Tom Friends, and they were all very successful. But in recent times, we've started to sort of go outside of this umbrella. We started thinking about our other IPs, or what else we can do aside from Talking Tom. And so most recently, this game that we developed was Mythic Legends. And this was a big challenge for all of us, because we stepped outside of this bubble that we had. And for developers, and I will say especially QAs such as myself, it was a new challenge, because all the learnings and all the experience we had from testing our previous games was no longer applicable. It was all to be forgotten, and we had to relearn everything that we knew. Now, in case you don't know what Mythic Legends is, let me just give you a little rundown about the game so that we all know what we're talking about. Now, the basic pitch is this. Mythic Legends is an asynchronous progression-based auto-battler. And I know these words are all very loaded, so let me break them down. We're starting at the end. We'll start with auto-battler. Auto-battlers are a genre of games where essentially the main point is that the mechanic of battling happens automatically. The rest of the game, so the strategic ideas, everything happens in the setup phase, or wherever you can decide how to make your decisions. The second one, the middle one, the progression one, makes this a little bit specific. Most of the other auto-battlers on the market are actually not progression-based. They're done in a way where inside a tournament, things happen only inside a tournament, and as soon as the tournament is done, your progression resets. But we made it a little bit more mobile-specific, so that you could keep your progression and have it forever. So it's a kind of like a mixture of a card game and an auto-battler. And the last one, another thing that made it very unique, was the asynchronous part. If you've played any of the other auto-battlers, you'll know that they are done in real time. You enter a tournament, and then for the next 15 to 35 minutes, depending on how good you are at the game, you are stuck there and you have to keep playing the game. But our game functions in a different format. You're never actually playing against real-time users. You are playing against what we call snapshots of what other players did. So someone plays a tournament, we record everything they did, and then later on we serve that to a different user. And based on that, you can leave the tournament at any time. You can play for 2 minutes while you're in the bathroom, and then play later on when you're cooking dinner again. Now, just a little bit about the game. If you can see this little GIF here, the things we're going to talk about, the important things are this big thing you see here, which is what we call heroes. We only have a couple of those, and they are like the generals of the army. And then we have champions on the actual board, and they're less important. There's more of them, and they're going to be very crucial to how testing was done. Okay, so I was very lucky to be able to join the team of Mythic Legends very early on. I was only the second quality engineer to join the team, and to this day I'm the longest standing quality engineer still working on the team, on the game. And initially our scope was very, let's say, basic. We had ideas of how many champions and heroes we wanted, and we started off with a simple 2 heroes, 8 champions configuration. And this was an okay idea. I was going to start testing and see how it goes. And then I was first introduced to what champions in this game are even going to look like. And so here I have an example of personally, currently probably my favorite champion in the game, who's also very strong if you're going to play the game. It's Kalach. And Kalach, as you can see on the picture, he has a bunch of different stats. And these are the stats that were the initial scope of testing. So I had to make sure that all of these work correctly. And the main ones that we use are health, attack speed, critical strike chance, defense, attack range, and ability. And if you've ever played any RPGs, you'll know that these are kind of standard. So you might think, OK, the initial testing was then pretty easy. And it kind of was. It was basically me positioning a champion on board and then another champion on board, having them battle and seeing, OK, does Xsolla, with his attack, do the correct amount of damage based on his attack, the opponent's defense, his health, etc. And this produced a couple of bugs, as I always do as a quality engineer, but it wasn't anything too spectacular. It was only when I started to realize that testing was not going to be just about a singular unit battling a singular unit that problems started to arise. So beyond just the one-on-one interactions, the game actually focuses on the synergies between champions or how champions can interact with one another. And so with the aid that we had in the initial scope of the game, I started to test those things. And then when I saw that that's how it was going to be done, I started to do just a little bit of math. So let me just walk you through this. This was the initial scope. Our board here is a 5x4 board, so 20 possible positions for you to place your champions. We had 8 champions and 2 heroes. And then when I was testing, I was thinking, OK, well, how many different permutations can I make of this? Like, what exactly are all the possible things that I should test? And so I went and did a little bit of math. And so thinking about it, we have 2 heroes, so that's going to be 2. And then 20 of the slots on the board where you can place your champion, that's going to be times 20. Any of the 8 champions, that's times 8. And then since we've already placed a champion, there's going to be 19 positions and 7 champions, etc., until you've used up all 8 of your champions. And now, in case you can't calculate this off the top of your head just like that, the answer is 409,579,462,656,000 possible permutations of champions and heroes on your side of the board. I'm pretty good at clicking. I did this on my device, but that number is way too big for me. Okay? And this number, however big it is, it assumes some very, very, very simple understandings of the game. Like I mentioned, the number of champions, the number of heroes, everything was very small. This does not take into account the fact that the exact same number of possibilities are also on the opponent's side of the board. So we would have to square that number. It does not take into account that there could be anywhere between 1 and 8 champions on board. That's another massive increase in number. It also doesn't take into account the fact that while this was the start, right now we don't have 8 champions, we have 54. We don't have 2 heroes, we have 8. And if you're calculating this right now, you might say, well, Marko, this grows exponentially. And you'd be right. And by the time we hit maybe like 4 or 5 heroes, we're already passing the number of atoms in the observable universe. And again, not very testable. So me, being the quality engineer tasked with testing this, I realized that something needed to be done so that testing could be done and to make sure it's actually worthwhile. So the stuff that I actually test is going to matter in the game. And so I turned to my greatest friends, developers. Now, QAs and developers have a very specific relationship. They like to produce bugs. We like to find bugs. And then they hate us for finding bugs because we give them more work. But in this specific scenario, I was very dependent on developers to help me out. There are 2 key pillars that we focused on to make sure that any of the testing that was done was actually useful. The first one was determinism. There was a lot of effort initially done to make sure that the game was deterministic. Just to tell you what that is, it just basically means that the exact same champions on the exact same positions, with the exact same heroes, exact same board, exact same opponent, produce the exact same result. And why is this so important? Because if you think about all the possible and impossible things to test, they're only relevant if I can actually know that this is going to happen again. If there's randomness involved, then I can never reproduce a bug and I can never know what actually caused it. But with this, every time I found something, I could exactly know this and this needed to be done. It was reproducible and it was then also fixable. And then the second one is that was my dear friend when I was testing, the debug menu. You can see this on the GIF here again. Each of the champions on board has a little black square underneath it, and when you click on it, you get essentially all the info that you could possibly want as a QA. You get info about their statistics that I mentioned before. You get info about where they are moving, where they are going to move. You get info about which animation is currently being played. You get info about how much damage is being dealt, how much damage they are taking, how much mana they are getting, etc., etc., etc. I could keep going. And this kept growing and growing because more things were added to the game. But this was so crucial in knowing, in me being able to recognize, okay, there's a wrong amount of damage being applied here because of this and this. Without this sort of very clear and very intentional debug menu, I could never find it. And so my great takeaway from this relationship that I had with our developers is that the effort they put in at the start, when we're thinking about the game or when we're establishing how it's going to be tested, can mean a lot of less effort on the QA side. Maybe a week of work to make sure the game was deterministic meant that I could now no longer test for trillions of years, but maybe for like a week as well. Okay, so we know all of that. We know it can be tested. It can be done. So it was time for me back in the day to actually start testing and to see how these things are going to work. Now, as a QA, and if you are a QA, you're probably going to agree with me, one of the main ways you want to test is to just act like you're a monkey. I want to press all the buttons. I want to play with all 5 of my fingers at the same time. And while this was an important part of testing the game, it wasn't what I would call the essential part of this kind of testing. The testing that I did for gameplay didn't actually happen on a device. It happened, I could say, in my head. It was more about thinking what could happen and what interactions could be problematic, more so than actually going out there and just randomly clicking these things. And as an example of how you can imagine this happen is another one of my favorite champions is Gravelord here, and he was a big troublemaker early on in development. Now, Gravelord is a priest, and for anyone playing RPG games, you'll know that priests often have a sort of healing mechanic, and it's similar also for Gravelord. And so if we read exactly what he does, he says it transfers 25% of max health and 100% of the mana from a target to an allied champion with lowest health. And by doing that, he also heals by 200% of the health that was lost. Okay, this sounds like an okay definition. Our game designers did a good job. It sounds all good. And when I was initially testing it, it seemed like to work properly. But then I remember getting this thought, okay, that works, but what happens if Gravelord is last champion on the board? Okay, the only target he has to heal is himself, so he's going to heal himself. Okay, that might be problematic. But then what if the opponent's formation also only has a Gravelord left? They're both going to be healing each other while damaging the other and constantly being stuck in a loop of damaging and healing, and that's exactly what happened. Whenever the battle would result in 2 Gravelords being left on the field, it would just create an infinite loop. The interesting thing about this is that from a QA perspective of breaking the game or just wanting it to crash or something like this, this isn't actually a bug, quote unquote. It works as intended. The definition of the ability is correct, and the implementation is also correct. We just didn't think about a case like this. We didn't think about a very specific scenario that could happen. And this kind of thinking and this approach, where you're not just trying to crash the game, you're not just trying to see what would happen if you do crazy things, but you try to also go into the role of a game designer and understand what should be intended, what shouldn't be intended, was I would say, the most important part of testing. Oftentimes, it wasn't just, when I found a bug, it wasn't just me going to a developer and talking to them, hey, can you fix this? It was me first going to the game designer thinking, hey, is this intended? Did you actually think about this? Or is this something that was just incorrectly implemented? It was a lot of communication directly to game designers and then to developers to see what the end result would actually be. And with all this said, you might think that logically, with every added champion, with every added permutation, the exponential growth of possibilities and so forth, you would think that every champion that we added would require more testing, more and more and more, and it would be really hard. But in practice, this didn't actually happen. Initially, for each champion, it took me about a week to find all the things that could be wrong and to test it out. But later on, this was reduced down to maybe a day or 2. And it simply comes from the same idea. It wasn't about seeing things that could crash or checking all the possible permutations. It was about understanding where things could potentially go wrong and then accounting for those things in actual testing. And okay, this all sounds okay. It sounds good. But all of this doesn't mean anything if we didn't actually perform. Like if this didn't actually end up working out as it should. And I'm going to tell you honestly, when we released this game, I was very scared. It was the first time that I was more or less solely responsible for gameplay testing, and I had to make sure that by the time the game goes out, there's not going to be game-breaking bugs that I just didn't figure out because I wasn't smart enough or I didn't think about it enough. And the reality of the situation is we did find a couple bugs in production, or when it was already live, but they were very, very, very rare. There are 2 examples I can think of when one champion couldn't get any mana, so he couldn't cast his ability, which is, you could say game-breaking, but it didn't cause any bigger issues. And there was another one where one champion was stuck in one place and couldn't move. And that's about it. We had some other funny things, like we have a dragon in the game, and he once flew out of the screen, and it was also found by a user who reported it to us, but it wasn't actually all that problematic. And so later on, when I was tasked with giving this feature over to someone, I also, when I was explaining it, it was always just a simple explanation of, don't press all the buttons, just think about the game. Imagine what could happen. Imagine if maybe healing and dealing damage at the same time is problematic. Think about the game, and then go on your device and actually click it. And by doing that, we managed to test something that should, and kind of is, impossible. We tested as many things as we could, but those things were really just a very, 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 very small percentage of all the possible permutations. And so my greatest takeaway from all of this is that sometimes it's more important to know what you don't test than to know what you're actually going to test. Okay, thank you for your attention, and if anyone has any questions, you're more welcome to ask.
Thank you for your speech. If you have any questions, there is a microphone, you can come and ask something. Okay, then I will torture you with the questions. You mentioned about that bug that you found with the priest, right? Mm-hmm. And how many cases you have? Does these cases even appear when you push developers to delete the character or just totally rework it? How often it happens?
Yeah, so like I said, most of it was not on the developers. It was mostly on the game designers to think of extra cases. But it happened, I would say, every time we added a new mechanic. So for example, this was the first champion that had healing. That required a lot of rework. Then when we added invulnerability, that required a whole new rework. So I would say, yeah, that's the idea. Like every time a new mechanic was added, we needed to change something drastically. But outside of this, not that much. It was mostly like we had a spreadsheet of special cases that needed to be handled, and there was maybe like 15 or 20 of those for like a year of development.
And I think sometimes new mechanics can break old ones.
Yes, obviously, like things you have to. That was one of the things you had to think about: the interactions, not only with things that are coming in, but also with things that are like ancient. Yeah, some of our champions that we added, like one of the initial 8. Kept breaking the game at some point in testing when the 50th champion was added.
Okay. And do you have any cases in your job when the bug became a feature during the tests? Or maybe players found something?
That's a good question. I'm sure my developers will tell you that every bug is a feature. Yeah, I don't remember specific cases. But for many of the cases that I found like this, where we figured out that there was an interaction that we didn't think of, oftentimes the answer was, we didn't think of this, but it should be like this. Like we discovered that some of the healing properties that we had should actually be done like this. I just remember a case, actually. It was one of our champions died, and then when he revived, he would heal back up. And so the question was, is he allowed to heal in the 4 seconds that he's reviving or not? And we eventually decided that it works better if he does. And so even though we didn't think of it, it was later on sent as a feature. Yeah.
And okay, yeah, sure, you can ask a question.
Hi. Yeah, I'm a developer, so I was wondering how much extra work after the initial implementation, how much maybe reworking did the quite advanced debugging menu tool take?
So okay, let me talk about maybe the stuff we added to the debug menu. It didn't take that much effort because all of the stuff that we had was already in the game. Like say the mechanic of getting mana for a champion, it was already in the game, it was already being done. So it was just a matter of making sure it's displayed correctly in the debug menu. So I wouldn't say the debug menu itself was a lot of extra work. The biggest part of it was initially figuring out how we want it to look like, what the data that we actually wanted displayed was, and how we can make it so it's actually like readable. Because like I said, when you have 15 champions on board, if you just got a log of everything that's happening, you'd be like, yeah, I can't read this. So it was more so about making sure that it was usable by the QAs.
Any questions? And this looks like a very complex game. Do you use beta tests with the players, or usually you just do only internal testing?
Yes.
And how often you do it?
Okay, so both actually. A lot of internal testing. We do two kinds of internal testing. One is done by our QA team, so that would be me. And then we also have a dedicated group of people who play the game inside the company to help us find bugs for new features or ideas for things that could break. So we use that for a bit. And then for external testing that was done, we also had some focus groups done on that, but it was not so much about what I just talked about, gameplay. It was more so about understanding other features like our social feature, adding friends and stuff like that, to see if that was something that was understandable to users, and not so much actual bug hunting, I would say.
Okay. Okay, so if there is no questions, yeah, okay, please come and ask.
Hi, thank you for your report. I'd like to know, do you fix such areas that you decided not to test in documentation to determine matrix coverage or something like that?
Sorry, can you repeat?
Yeah. Do you fix such areas that you decided not to test, like such a button, that not to test? And how do you determine matrix coverage of your project?
Okay, so yeah, the decision to fix things or not to fix things is, or to test them or not to test them, is not something that's done, I would say, very robustly. It was mostly done by, it was us deciding things that we thought were relevant and weren't relevant, so that was the first part. And then for the actual coverage of stuff we tested, it wasn't really as concrete as you might imagine. Like we didn't have a very clear idea of we tested this percentage and this much. A lot of it was about the feeling of things that could break and couldn't break and whether or not we want to fix them.
More questions? Don't be shy to stand in line in front of the microphone if you want. Okay, then thank you for your speech.
Thank you for listening.
Really interesting. Please rate the session in Pine. It's very important. Every star matters.